Because of our family schedules, I have 2 children, I'm often the parent who picks up the boys from their after-school care and shuttles them around Bedford to piano or karate or whatever it is that day. So I spend a lot of time in the late afternoon in the car driving a well-choreographed routine from point A to B, back to C, then D, then home, finally. Generally, the radio in Daddy Taxi is set to NPR, so this route is accompanied by the dulcet tones of afternoon newscasts. Now, some of the legs in this route, I'm in the car by myself, but sometimes I have one or more of the kids with me. So I've gotten pretty good at adjusting the volume level in each leg based on who is in the car with me, because there are some things even a 7-year-old isn't ready to hear yet. And lately, those things are on NPR. Okay, this week was particularly bad in that regard. By Wednesday, the volume was all the way down, even when I was driving by myself in the car, because I just couldn't listen anymore to the hours and hours of testimony from that courtroom in Michigan of these brave young women and their parents talking about the years of abuse that they had suffered at the hands of an athletic trainer. It is just horrific on every level. The criminal pathology of the assailant, the persistence of the abuse over decades, the hesitancy of the institutions to investigate, and the reluctance of supervisors to act and protect young people. It is unthinkable. Except, of course, that it's a chain of events that we've seen before in several other kinds of institutions, schools, in healthcare, even in churches. As much as I wanted to turn away from the whole mess to avoid the depths of sadness and anger in this chaos, I couldn't do it. The voices of the survivors, each one unique and different, all spoke with an undercurrent of such power and moral clarity that they compelled my attention. Their strength to stand up and say what happened to them, to push through whatever feelings of shame may have been lurking within them, to speak of their pain and their resilience out in the open, to model for other survivors of sexual abuse that a future of healing and self-love is possible. That's a kind of courage to which I can only aspire, and to which I pray I am never called to have to do myself. So I turned the radio back on, and I allowed my despair at the crimes they endured to be companioned by my respect for their testimony and a renewal of my own commitments to do whatever I can in my life to be an agent of change. In today's gospel, Mark writes that when Jesus first began to teach in the synagogue, people were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. The Greek word for authority here is exousia, ex, from or out of, ousia, being or essence. Exousia means from our very essence, from the core of our being. Mark is comparing Jesus' teaching, which comes from his own being, his own essence, to the scribes' teaching, which comes from explication of Mosaic law. It's a little different. Unlike the theoretical reasoning of the scribes, which Mark finds lacking, Mark describes Jesus' kind of teaching as having exousia, having authority, because it comes from his very essence. It is Jesus' willingness to speak with this real authority from the depths of his being, to testify to what he knows is his essential truth, that proves so deeply compelling to everyone who hears it. And all week, as I was preparing to preach on this lesson, I couldn't help but think of these women athletes and their parents testifying to the truth of their experience in court. They spoke with voices at times fragile, other times defiant, but always as ones having authority, as ones revealing truth about something that had been hidden or forgotten or denied or suppressed for too long. And this is exactly what Jesus did when he began his ministry of teaching and speaking in public. He shared the essential truth of God's compassion and love for all people at a time when those who should have been paying the most attention to that truth had hidden it from others, or forgotten it, or denied it, or suppressed it for their own selfish reasons. Those who spoke in that courtroom this week were speaking from the same depths of truth as Jesus spoke. And so it may have been the judge's words, as she sentenced the defendant, that had the most power in that courtroom, but it was the words of the survivors that carried the most authority. They were the ones who sounded the most like Jesus. And it is my hope and my prayer that the moral authority of these survivors' teachings will have a similar impact on those who hear them as Jesus' words did. Returning to Mark's gospel, he writes that the crowd in the synagogue is astounded by Jesus' words. They're attracted to them like a moth to a flame. They want more from him, and they don't even know why. It's just an instinct. But unlike a moth, it isn't a physical instinct that compels them. It's a moral instinct. You and I have felt such moral attractions before, haven't we? Maybe even with Jesus, but not necessarily only with Jesus. Certainly with some other kind of teacher to you. Someone who you just knew was speaking with authority from the truth of their being in a way that compelled you to pay attention to them, in a way that made you want to follow them however you could, to take every course they offered in the catalog, to angle your way onto every project team with them that you could at work, to buy every single one of their CDs or records and play them as loud as your parents would allow it. We knew moral authority when we heard it, and we still do. There's also potentially a danger in this almost awestruck attraction to truth tellers that seems built into our humanity. And that danger is that we remain awestruck and fail to move to action. We see hints of this in Mark. Again, the Greek is much more descriptive. The word for astounded is esplesso, which can also be translated as struck with panic. Struck with panic. And I appreciate this overtone because it rings as something of a warning. When we hear people speaking from the depths of their own experience with a power and a moral authority that really resonates with us, I'm filled with both awe, but also a little bit of fear. Because when someone tells deep truth and it's recognized as such, it implies that change is coming. It reveals that the reconciled future that God longs for must be somehow different than the brokenness of the present that is described in such compelling speech. The demons in the gospel today recognize this right away. They acknowledge the authority with which Jesus speaks. They call him the Holy One of God. They know his words have power. They know the days in which they can possess others and use them for destructive purposes are numbered. And ultimately, they are compelled by the authority with which Jesus speaks to flee away, even as the crowds seem content to just stand amazed. There is a challenge here in Mark's telling of the story about whether those who follow Jesus will become as responsive to the authority of his teaching as the mystical demons that oppose him. We know from these stories that Jesus' disciples are just as attracted to him as the demons are. The question is, will they be as responsive? Will they be transformed by this speech that astounds them? Or are they content to just be astounded, to marvel, to puzzle? There's a similar challenge to us and to our society in the stories told by those brave survivors in that Michigan courtroom. The challenge is whether we will be not just morally attracted to their courageous testimony, but morally responsive to it. Will we examine our personal behaviors and actions to ensure that we are signaling to victims who are not yet survivors that sexual abuse is something which we are ready to listen to? Will we educate and prepare ourselves so we know what to do if a friend or a child or a parent or a coworker tells us that they're being victimized or that they know someone who is? Will we create a culture in which reports of suspected abuse cause us not to be struck with panic, but to be committed to effective response? Will we reflect on how the systems in which we live and work and play and pray can reduce the likelihood that abuse of any kind occurs and increase the likelihood that if it does happen, it will be reported, investigated, acted upon with thought, care, and compassion? Now, these may sound like easy questions to say yes to, but of course, they're always hard to operationalize. I'm proud that your vestry recently took one small step forward by revising our church's Safe Church guidelines, and they're now posted in the parish hall in full, and I encourage you to look at them. They're an important affirmation that our congregation actively works to prevent all kinds of abuse and stands ready to hear stories, provide support, and affirm the humanity of anyone who finds themselves in an abusive situation, whether as a victim, a witness, or a perpetrator. As Christians, we are reminded to listen attentively for those around us who speak with authority, for those who do speak the words of Christ to us today. Their voices are not always loud, they're not always confident, and they're not always on the radio. Their stories can seem unfamiliar. Their words and teachings may leave us astounded or struck with panic. But God has given to all human beings an inherent attraction to those who speak with true moral authority. Our work as friends of Jesus is to give thanks for that instinctive attraction to truth, to amplify those voices when they're speaking softly or are drowned out by the noise, and to trust that they are leading us all into holy transformations in which whatever we fear may be lost is counted as gain for Christ's sake. Amen.